Martha Ann Johnson is an American serial killer from Georgia, convicted of smothering to death 3 of her children between 1977 and 1982. On July 3, 1989, Johnson was arrested, and she confessed to killing 2 of her children. After confrontations with her husband, Johnson would suffocate the children by rolling her 250-pound body on them as they slept. She claimed the motive was to punish her husband. Johnson claimed she was not responsible for the deaths of her 2 youngest children. By the beginning of her trial in April 1990, Johnson had retracted her confession. On May 5, 1990, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, later commuted to life on appeal. She was housed at Pulaski State Prison before being granted parole in 2020. The Yanquan Theater bombing was a mass murder-suicide that occurred at a theater in Yanquan, Shaanxi, China on July 22, 1981, when 24-year-old Gao Haiping detonated a self-made explosive device that killed 32 people including himself and wounded 127 others. Gao Haiping, together with the girl who had dumped him previously, wanted to visit a film screening at the San Kuang Club. When the woman did not show up, Gao entered the theater alone and took his place in seat 25, in the second row. At about 8 p.m. he put the bomb on his lap and detonated it manually, killing himself and 31 other people, and wounding another 127, 44 of whom were sent to hospitals. Furthermore, the explosion caused a partial collapse of the theater's roof and shattered the glass doors of the building. Ricardo Silvio Caputo was an Argentine-American serial killer during the 1970s, known to authorities as the Lady Killer. This suave Argentinian was arrested in 1994 after a 20-year murderous rampage. His first victim was a young woman from New York who he strangled and stabbed in the early 70s. Caputo was arrested for the murder and placed in a mental hospital from which he subsequently escaped. A smooth-talking con artist, Ricardo left a trail of blood spanning from New York through San Francisco to Mexico City. Although he's only been charged with 4 murders, it is believed his tally is much higher. Though he is known to have committed at least 4 murders, he is not considered by many to be a serial killer. Incarcerated at Attica State Prison in New York, Caputo had a fatal heart attack in October 1997 at the age of 48. January 19, 1866, 50-year-old Martha Grinder, the Pittsburgh poisoner, was hanged in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for the poisoning by arsenic of Mary Carruthers and Jane Buchanan, crimes to which she confessed. She told the astonished jury at her trial, "I love to see death in all its forms and phases, and left no opportunity to gratify my tastes for such sights. Could I have had my own way, probably I should have done more." She went bravely to the gallows set up in the Pittsburgh prison yard and seemed quite serene in the face of death. It is suspected that these 2 women were not her only victims. A thorough medical test was made of her mental condition and the conclusion was unanimous that she was entirely sane. Samuel Leonard Boyd is an Australian multiple murderer from New South Wales, currently serving 5 consecutive sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, for the murder of 4 people and the malicious wounding of 1. On September 1982, Boyd stabbed and slashed the throat of Rhonda Celia while he was working at her home as a pest exterminator in Busby, Glenfield massacre on April 22, 1983. In the early hours of the morning, Boyd beat Gregory Wiles to death with a hammer. Boyd later went to a school for handicapped children in Glenfield. He forced the 3 woman supervisors, Helen Hartop, Patricia Valsic, and Olive Short, to undress, and then proceeded to threaten them and made them sexually abuse each other before slashing and stabbing each in the neck. It is expected that Boyd will die in custody. Elisabeth Wiese was a German serial killer from Hamburg, convicted and executed for the killing of 5 children. She offered her services as a child carer to women who could not raise their children themselves. She then informed the mothers of babies left in her care that she had the babies adopted by rich families in distant countries. What she actually did was poison the babies with morphine and burn their bodies in a stove in her apartment. Suspicions grew about the fate of these babies, and investigations began. Wiese forced her daughter Paula into prostitution and she became pregnant. She returned to Hamburg and gave birth in a cellar. Immediately after the birth, Wiese drowned Paula's baby and burnt the body in the stove. On October 10, 1904, Wiese was convicted in court of fraud, living off immoral earnings and the murder of 5 children. She was executed by guillotine in 1905. Volker Eggert was a German serial killer known as the Brummie Killer. Eggert worked as a trucker between 2001 and 2006 and confessed to have abducted, tortured, and killed 5 prostitutes in Western Europe. Between 1979 and 1987, Volker Eggert began attacking women in the dark streets of Plauen. During these attacks, Eggert throttled his victims but did not kill any of them. In 1974, Eggert was 15 years old when he strangled a 14-year-old girl in Germany. Spanish police identified Eggert as a suspect after images of his tanker truck was captured where the corpse of a murdered roadside prostitute was found. Polaroids and trophies were allegedly found in his truck cab. Police considered him the perpetrator of 9 murders, with 4 more victims being possible. In 2007, Volker Eggert committed suicide by hanging himself in prison. Angel Maturino Resendez, also known as the Railroad Killer, was a Mexican itinerant serial killer, suspected in as many as 23 murders across the United States and Mexico during the 1990s. During his crimes, he was known to strangle, rape, and murder his victims. Some also involved sexual assault. He had become known as the Railroad Killer, as most of his crimes were committed near railroads where he had jumped off the trains which he was using to travel around the country. On June 21, 1999, he briefly became the 457th fugitive listed by the FBI on its 10 most wanted fugitives list, before he surrendered to the Texas authorities on July 13, 1999. He was convicted of capital murder in Texas and executed by lethal injection in 2006. Jesha Margarethi Gottfried was a serial killer who murdered 15 people by arsenic poisoning in Bremen and Hanover, Germany, between 1813 and 1827. She was the last person to be publicly executed in the city of Bremen. Gottfried's victims included her parents, her 2 husbands, her fiancé, and her children. Her poison of choice was a mixture of arsenic and fat called mouse butter, as it was usually used to kill mice. Before being suspected and convicted of the murders, she garnered widespread sympathy among the inhabitants of Bremen because so many of her family and friends fell ill and died. Because of her devoted nursing of the victims during their time of suffering, she was known as the Angel of Bremen, until her murders were discovered. She was executed by guillotine on April 21, 1831. Jarvis Theodore Roosevelt Cato, sometimes referred to as the DC Strangler, was an American serial killer. On August 29, 1941, he confessed to the murders of 7 women in Washington and 1 in New York City. 4 others had been raped but left alive, and he reportedly had failed in efforts to abduct 2 more. Another slaying in the District of Columbia was added on September 1. Corroborating his confession, he reportedly acted normal until he sustained a head injury in 1925. Afterwards he began to show odd behavior and is believed to have killed his first victim just 4 years later. Cato was twice arrested for exposing himself in public, and racked up numerous arrests for traffic violations. Between 1935 and 1941, Cato was executed via the electric chair. Sarah Aldrete is a convicted Mexican serial killer known as La Madrina, who headed a drug smuggling and human sacrifice cult with Adolfo Constanzo. The members of the cult, dubbed by the media as the narco-Satanists, called her the Godmother. The cult was involved in multiple ritualistic killings in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, including the murder of Mark Kilroy, an American student killed in 1989. When detectives discovered their shrine, they found human hair, brains, teeth, and skulls at the site of the murders. The police found their hideout in Mexico City on May 6, 1989. She was convicted of several of the killings at the cult's headquarters, and sentenced to 62 years in prison. If Aldrete is ever released from prison, American authorities plan to prosecute her for the murder of Mark Kilroy. Michigan serial killer Gary Taylor spent his early years in Florida, launching his first attacks on women when he was in his teens. He began randomly attacking women with a hammer, usually near bus stops that he would loiter at in wait. Taylor was eventually incarcerated as a juvenile but was released in 1957. At 21, he drove through Detroit suburbs firing a gun at women. He wounded 2 and was billed by newspapers as the Phantom Sniper. He also robbed, raped, and stabbed a number of other women. After he killed his victims, he would cover their bodies in plastic bags and bury them on his property. In late 1973, Taylor stopped taking his medication and failed to show up at his hospital. He was subsequently classified as an escaped mental patient. Taylor was convicted on the 4 counts he confessed to and sentenced to life. December 24, 2008, at approximately 11:30 p.m., Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, dressed in a Santa Claus suit, knocked on the door of his former in-law's house, occupied with about 25 people, with a gift-wrapped package, containing a homemade flamethrower in one hand, and a semi-automatic handgun in the other. When the door opened, Pardo fired the handgun at an 8-year-old girl in the face as she ran to greet him. He then fired indiscriminately at fleeing partygoers. After the shootings, Pardo unwrapped the package containing the flamethrower and used it to spray racing fuel to set the home ablaze. 9 people died from either gunfire or flames, and 3 others were wounded. The recovered bodies were severely burned and charred. Dental records were needed to establish identities. After the massacre, Pardo took his own life with a single gunshot to the head. Andrew Grant DeYoung was an American murderer who was executed by lethal injection in Georgia on July 21, 2011 for the 1993 murder of his family in the state of Georgia. Along with accomplice, DeYoung went to his parents' home and stabbed his mother to death while she was in bed. Her screams awakened his father. As he struggled with his father, his 14-year-old sister Sarah came to the doorway. DeYoung slashed his father to death and then stabbed and killed Sarah in the hallway. His 16-year-old brother Nathan escaped through a bedroom window and returned with a neighbor who identified Andrew. Andrew's plan was to start a business and needed his inheritance, which he estimated at $480,000. The plan was to kill the entire family and set fire to the home. Accomplice Haggerty pled guilty and received 3 concurrent life sentences. Nicola Bush-Reef is an American woman who was convicted of the 2007 Villa Park, Illinois murder of her lesbian lover, Rebecca Klein. After being found guilty of first-degree murder in May 2009, Bush-Reef was sentenced to 50 years in prison at the Dwight Correctional Center in Nevada Township, Illinois. The case made national news due to the intrigue of a lesbian love triangle murder. On March 17, 2007, the body of Rebecca was discovered in the trunk of her 1966 Ford Mustang after Klein's domestic partner of 7 years, Nicole, reported her missing. Klein was found bound with duct tape, gagged with a bandana, blindfolded, and suffocated with a plastic bag over her head. 4 days later, Bush-Reef was charged with first-degree murder and concealing of a homicide. Joshua Jenkins is an American killer who killed all 5 members of his family while visiting his grandparents who lived in California. In 1996, when he was 15, he eventually pleaded guilty to 5 cases of first-degree murder for killing his adoptive parents George and Aline Jenkins, his grandparents, William and Evelyn Grossman, by hitting them in the head with a hammer and stabbing them with a kitchen knife. He later took his 10-year-old sister Megan Jenkins to buy an axe. He had her pick the axe he used to murder her with. He also pleaded guilty to a count of arson for setting several condos on fire in an attempt to hide the evidence. The bodies were found stacked on top of one another with several stab wounds to their chests and backs. He was eventually sentenced to 112 years in prison without parole. Frank Bitkovic was an Australian mass murderer responsible for the Queen Street Massacre. At 4 p.m. on December 8, 1987, Bitkovic walked into a building in Melbourne's Queen Street holding a brown paper bag and carrying a sawed-off M1 carbine. He entered the 5th floor offices of the Australia Post, pulled a sawn-off shotgun from the bag, and began firing at fleeing workers, killing a young woman office worker. Bitkovic went from floor to floor randomly shooting victims in the elevators and in offices. On the 12th floor, Bitkovic's gun was wrestled away from him by an office worker named Frank Carmody. The weapon was immediately hidden in a refrigerator by another worker. Bitkovic then broke a window on the floor, and despite attempts by postal workers to save him, he jumped and fell to his death on Queen Street. The 6 newborn babies each lived less than 2 minutes. Their mother, lost in a haze of desperation and addiction, pressed her thumbs to their throats and choked them. She remembered using a hair tie one time. She smothered or strangled 6 of her own flesh and blood. Prosecutors asked why. To be sure it was dead, Huntsman explained. Huntsman, 40, pleaded guilty in February to 6 counts of murder, a first-degree felony. She was sentenced to 6 terms of 5 years to life in prison for murdering the babies between 1996 and 2006, then packaging their bodies and hiding them in her garage for years to come. Neighbors noticed she gained and lost weight through the years but never suspected that she was pregnant. Huntsman was addicted to drugs at the times of the other births and couldn't afford to keep the babies and still have her methamphetamine. Anatoly Onoprienko, also known as the Beast of Ukraine, was a Soviet serial killer who murdered 52 victims. He would choose an isolated house and gain the attention of the occupants. He would then kill them all, starting with the adult male before killing the spouse and finally the children. He would then usually set the buildings alight in an attempt to cover his tracks. He would also kill any witness unlucky enough to cross his path. The first to die were a family of 4 in Bratkoviki. Another family of 5 and 2 witnesses were killed not long after. He then moved to other villages to continue killing. Onoprienko was found after a massive manhunt 7 years after his first murder. He was sentenced to death April 1999, commuted to life in prison August 1999. He died in prison on August 27, 2013. Ramon Salcido is a Mexican convicted spree killer who is currently on death row at San Quentin State Prison. He thought his wife Angela was having an affair with his boss. Angela was planning to leave him. After spending a night snorting cocaine and drinking, he drove his daughters to a dump near Petaluma, where he slit the girls' throats with a fishing knife. 2 of them died. He then went to his in-laws' house and clubbed to death his mother-in-law, Marion Richards. He also slit the throats of Marion's 2 youngest daughters, whom he sodomized and sexually assaulted. He then went back home where he found Angela and shot her to death. He then went and killed his boss. After the killings, he headed to his hometown of Los Mochis in Mexico to see his mother. There he was arrested by authorities. The 2010 Lorik Hospital shooting rampage occurred on September 19 in the small town of Lorik, Germany, near the Swiss border. Sabine Radmacher, a 41-year-old woman, smothered her 5-year-old son and then shot and stabbed the boy's father, who was her ex-partner. She then set fire to the flat, eventually causing an explosion. She crossed the street to St. Elizabethan Hospital, where she shot and stabbed one male nurse, killing him and severely injuring 2 passers-by and a police officer. Soon after, the woman was fatally shot by special police units. The investigators established that the woman was a female lawyer who had killed her former common-law husband and their 5-year-old son in a nearby apartment block. She was a sporting markswoman and used a .22 caliber sports pistol and a knife. Emmett and John Langley were sharing a room in a Danville motel in April of 2001 as part of a roofing crew. On the night Langley was killed, he bought food and grilled for Emmett and other co-workers. Later Langley was killed as he slept. The police discovered Langley's dead body lying face down on the bed beneath a comforter. Blood spatters were found on the sheets and headboard of Langley's bed, on the wall behind it, and on the wall between the bathroom and Emmett's bed. A damaged brass lamp stained with Langley's blood was discovered beneath Langley's bed. In a taped confession to police, Emmett admitted striking Langley in the head with the lamp in the motel room they were sharing, robbing him of $100, buying and smoking crack cocaine, then calling the police to report that something had happened to his roommate. Emmett was executed by lethal injection in Virginia on July 24, 2008. Ronald Simmons was an American spree killer who killed 16 people and wounded several others over a week-long period in Arkansas in 1987. Simmons murdered 14 members of his family, including a daughter he had sexually abused and the child he had fathered with her, as well as a former co-worker and a stranger. He also wounded 4 others. Shortly before Christmas 1987, Simmons decided to kill all the members of his family. On the morning of December 22nd, he first killed his wife Rebecca and eldest son Gene by bludgeoning them with a hammer and shooting them with a .22 caliber pistol. He then killed his 3-year-old granddaughter Barbara by strangulation. He is the most prolific mass murderer in Arkansas history. Simmons was sentenced to death on each of 16 counts, and after refusing to appeal his sentence, he was executed on June 25, 1990. Joseph Danks, known as the Koreatown Slasher, is an American serial killer who killed 6 homeless men in January 1987 in Los Angeles, Koreatown. The first known victim was Christopher Fursblade, age 40, found dead on January 6. 8 days later, the slasher killed Isaac Davis, then 55-year-old John Coble. Less than 3 hours later, a John Doe victim in his early 40s was slain on January 16, but the killer missed his mark the next day, leaving Almond Lord alive. Another near miss with 58-year-old James Lyons, but he killed his second John Doe in a downtown alley, then followed by witnesses and cornered by police. The suspect dropped his knife, submitting to arrest. Danks confessed to the series of stabbings after his knife blade was matched to the wounds of his victims. Danks remains incarcerated on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Daryl Keith Rich, known as the Hilltop Rapist, was an American serial killer who murdered 3 women and an 11-year-old girl in Redding, California between June and August 1978. Annette Edwards was beaten to death with a rock. Linda Slavic was driven by Rich to his house in Cottonwood, where she was raped and then driven to a remote area where she was shot and killed. Annette Selix was driven by Rich to his house, where he committed acts of rape and sodomy. He then drove her to Johns Creek Bridge and threw her 105 feet to the rocks below. Rich was also convicted of sexual assaults on 4 other women and an attempted sexual assault on a 5th. Rich told a friend he had found a dead body. The friend informed police, who questioned Rich. After flunking a polygraph test, Rich confessed to each of the crimes. He was executed by lethal injection in California on March 15, 2000. Michele Kalina, 46, of Pennsylvania, secretly gave birth to 5 babies in her bathtub and hid the bodies in a closet, pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to the maximum 20 to 40 years in prison. The skeletal remains were estimated to be from 32 weeks in gestation to newly born. 4 of the babies were stillborn, but the third, a boy, was killed. That death was the basis for the 1 count of murder. Kalina conceived the babies through a long affair with a co-worker and hid the pregnancies from him and her husband. She told a psychiatrist she had wrapped each baby with a towel and then stored the bodies inside plastic tubs filled with cement and 2 more stuffed inside plastic bags in a cooler. She thought 4 were essentially stillborn and denied doing anything malicious. Kalina also said she abused the corpses of 5 infants. Robert Joe Wagner is an Australian serial killer, currently serving 10 consecutive sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for his role in the murder of 10 victims of the Snowtown murders, also known as the Bodies in Barrels murders. Wagner, driven to murder by his hatred for pedophiles, has been described as being amongst Australia's worst serial killers. The murders took place in South Australia between August 1992 and May 1999. Wagner fried and ate the flesh of his final victim, David Johnson. On September 27, 2002, Wagner pleaded guilty to 3 charges of murder for the murders of Barry Lane, Fred Brooks, and David Johnson. He would plead not guilty to the remaining 7 murder charges against him, but was eventually convicted of them, bringing the total number of victims to 10. Nathan Gale was a native of Marysville, Ohio, USA, who was killed by a police officer after he murdered several people at a concert, including heavy metal guitarist Dimebag Darrell. On December 8, 2004, he stormed the stage during a Damageplan concert at the All Rosa Villa in Columbus, Ohio, and proceeded to shoot and kill Darrell, former member of the heavy metal band Pantera. Dimebag Darrell Abbott was shot and killed on stage by Nathan Gale. Abbott was shot a total of 5 times, twice at point-blank range in the head. He was 38 years old. Nearby Columbus police officer James D. Nagemier quickly responded and shot Gale once in the face with the 12-gauge police-issue shotgun after a hostage managed to move out of the way. As shown in unedited footage of the incident, Gale's head was literally blown off by the shotgun blast. Mack Ray Edwards was an American serial killer. He murdered at least 6 children in Los Angeles County between 1953 and 1970. The body of one of his victims was found underneath the Santa Ana Freeway, and he claimed to have disposed of another of his victims under the Ventura Freeway. Edwards killed 3 children from 1953 to 1956, and 3 more in 1968 to 1969. In 1970, Edwards and a teenage male accomplice kidnapped 3 girls from their home in Sylmar. When the girls escaped, Edwards surrendered to police and confessed to molesting and murdering 6 children. After 3 bodies were recovered, Edwards pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and was sentenced to death. On October 30, 1971, Edwards committed suicide by hanging himself with the television cord in his cell in San Quentin. Joseph Roy Metheny was an American serial killer and rapist from the Baltimore, Maryland area. Metheny described to police how he viciously raped, murdered, and dismembered sex workers and people who were homeless. Then, Metheny confessed to his most disturbing crimes. Not only did he himself eat some of the victims' flesh, but he served it to other unknowing people as well. Metheny brought the bodies home. There, he dismembered them and stored the meatiest parts of them in Tupperware containers. Over the next several weekends, he mixed the sex workers' flesh with beef and pork, forming it into neat little patties. He would sell these meat patties out of a small barbecue stand he opened on the side of the road. Eventually, he was sentenced to life. Metheny was found dead in his jail cell in 2017. Paul Stephen Hay, is an Australian serial killer. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for the murders of 6 people, including a 10-year-old boy, in Victoria, between 1978 and 1979. In 1979 he killed people he believed knew too much about his crimes, including his associate's former girlfriend and her 10-year-old son who was a witness to his mother's death, sitting beside her when she was shot. He said he consoled the sobbing boy before shooting him 3 times in the back of the head. He stabbed one victim 157 times, later writing that, "I only intended to do 20, but I lost count," he said when her front was covered in wounds. He turned her over and stabbed her back. Hayes' last victim was a sex offender whom he helped to hang himself in 1991. Rosie Alfaro is an American murderer currently on California's death row for the 1990 murder of 9-year-old Autumn Wallace in Anaheim, California. Alfaro, who was 18 years old, pregnant, and high on cocaine and heroin, burgled the Wallace home for money to purchase drugs. When Alfaro originally planned to approach the Wallace home, she did not expect to find anyone there. When she found Autumn at home, she then realized she would have to kill her or she would know who committed the burglary. Alfaro stabbed Autumn 57 times and then proceeded to take everything of apparent value. The stolen property was later sold for less than $300. She later changed her original confession and stated that a male accomplice forced her to stab the girl. Alfaro has never identified the male. Police and the Orange County prosecutor say he never existed. Angry over his girlfriend meeting another man, Remy Grenier, 29, killed her with a crossbow and a Colt .45, then killed her mother and her 2 sisters. Remy lived with his girlfriend, Vassiana, and her family in the small village of Bassoha, 50 miles from Brussels. Remy's July 7, 1997 murderous rampage is believed to have been triggered when Vassiana told him that she had met another man, and that he would have to move. Police believe Vassiana, 24, and her 2 sisters ages 21 and 19, were drugged before the massacre because there were no signs of struggle. Vinciana was found dead in her bedroom. Her 2 younger sisters were found in their bedroom. They were naked and one had been sexually assaulted. The mother was found in the garage. He was sentenced to life in prison on December 7, 1999. The Crandon shooting was a mass murder that occurred on October 7, 2007, at a party inside a duplex in Crandon, Wisconsin, United States. Tyler James Peterson, a 20-year-old full-time deputy in the Forest County Sheriff's Department, and a part-time police officer at the Crandon Police Department, who was not on duty, entered an apartment complex where a homecoming party was held at approximately 2:45 a.m., and shot at 7 people, ages 14 to 20, killing 6 of them and wounding the 7th. The gunman was later killed, initially believed to have been killed by a police sniper, but it was later discovered that he committed suicide by multiple gunshots, with the 3rd shot being the fatal one. Police have reported that approximately 30 rounds were fired throughout the duration of the shooting. Ivan Milat, commonly known as the backpacker murderer, was an Australian serial killer who abducted, assaulted, robbed, and murdered 2 men and 5 women in New South Wales, between 1989 and 1992. His modus operandi was to approach backpackers along the Hume Highway, under the guise of providing them transport to areas of southern New South Wales, then take his victims into the Belanglo State Forest, where he would incapacitate and murder them. Examination of the remains showed evidence that some of the victims had been tortured, repeatedly shot and stabbed, beheaded, and had their spines severed. On October 27, 2019, Milat died from esophagus and stomach cancer at 4:07 a.m. within the hospital wing at Long Bay Correctional Center. He was 74 years old. Ed Gein was an American murderer and body snatcher from Plainfield, Wisconsin. Gein had exhumed corpses from local graveyards and fashioned trophies and keepsakes from their bones and skin. After police found body parts in his house in 1957, Gein confessed to killing two women, Mary Hogan in 1954 and Bernice Worden in 1957. Police discovered Worden's decapitated body in a shed, hung upside down by ropes at her wrists. The torso was gutted. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle and brutally mutilated after death. Initially found unfit to stand trial, he was tried in 1968 for the murder of Worden and sentenced to life imprisonment, which he spent in a mental hospital until his death on July 26, 1984, age 77. Tiffany Hall, 26, pled guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count of intentional homicide in the death of the fetus, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Hall struck her pregnant friend Jimela Tunstall, 23, on the head repeatedly with a table leg, then cut the fetus from her womb in a bathtub. Tunstall bled to death. Hall then dumped her body in an East St. Louis lot. 3 days later, Hall visited the father of 2 of Tunstall's children and the unborn child. He was caring for all 3 children. Hall told the father that Tunstall wanted her to pick up the children. He told the officers that was the last time he saw them. Hall then drowned the 3 children in the same bathtub where she killed their mother. The bodies of the 3 children were found 2 days later hidden in a washer and dryer inside the East St. Louis apartment where they had lived with their mother. Edmund Kemper is an American serial killer known as the Co-Ed Butcher. Kemper murdered 10 victims including his grandparents and mother. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to dismember, commit acts of cannibalism, commit acts of necrophilia, strangle, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. Between May 1972 and February 1973, Kemper embarked on a spree of murders, picking up female students hitchhiking, taking them to isolated rural areas and killing them. He would stab, shoot or smother the victims and afterwards take the bodies back to his apartment where he would have sex with them and then dissect them. In 1973, Kemper was sentenced to life imprisonment. In 2017, Edmund Kemper was procedurally denied parole and is next eligible in 2024. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was an American mass murderer who was tried and convicted for the 1974 killings of his father, mother, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters in Amityville, New York. All of the victims had been shot with the .35 caliber lever-action Marlin 336C rifle at around 3 o'clock in the morning. DeFeo's parents had both been shot twice, while the children had all been killed with single shots. Louise DeFeo and her daughter Allison were reportedly the only victims who were awakened by the gunfire at the time of their deaths, but the victims were all found lying on their stomachs in bed. The DeFeo family had occupied 112 Ocean Avenue since purchasing it in 1965. The murdered members of the DeFeo family are buried in nearby St. Charles Cemetery in Farmingdale. Ronald DeFeo Jr. died in prison on March 12, 2021. In early 2001, the Hungarian nurse, TIMEA FALUDI, then 24, confessed to killing approximately 40 elderly patients for mercy, by lethal injection, in a Budapest hospital in 2000 and 2001. The case was uncovered when the medical director of the Gala Enviro Hospital in Budapest noticed that the death toll was unusually high when Sister Timea was on night shift. Controls of the drug usage showed a shortage of tranquilizer. Police were called in and found she had illegally administered tranquilizers and painkillers to patients. Timea Faludi withdrew her confessions during trial, and as all the victims had been cremated, there was no evidence left. Faludi was sentenced to 9 years in prison for repeated attempts of murder and a lifelong prohibition to work as a nurse. On July 13, 1990, Dean Kilgore was convicted of first-degree murder and resentenced to death. Kilgore was serving 2 life sentences for prior offenses, first-degree murder and kidnapping, as well as a 5-year term for armed trespass. On February 13, 1989, while serving his sentence, Kilgore waited outside a cell that belonged to his lover, Emerson Robert Jackson. When Jackson appeared, Kilgore stabbed him 3 times with a homemade shank knife. After stabbing Jackson, Kilgore poured a caustic liquid onto Jackson's face and into his mouth. After the incident, Kilgore immediately went to the administration building and admitted the murder to the guards. Kilgore died while on death row, January 12, 2018. On the morning of December 23, 1995, Bruce Rich called police and told them that he had just found his parents dead. He told them that his parents had been shot and that the gun was still in his mother's mouth. The victims were killed by Blanche Rich's own .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol. Police dismissed the murder-suicide theory. Both victims suffered multiple gunshot wounds to the head. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was stolen. Detectives began to believe the killing was a homicide made to resemble a murder-suicide, and they began to focus on the sole benefactor of his parents' life insurance policy and will, Bruce Rich. He killed his parents, placed the gun in his mortally wounded mother's hand, then put the gun in her mouth, and then pulled the trigger. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole on March 22, 2000. Police in Italy were called to the scene of a murder where a woman had killed her 3 children near Milan. 37-year-old EDLIKA DOBRUSHI had stabbed her 3 daughters to death in their beds, and is believed to have injured herself on the wrists and neck with a kitchen knife because her husband had left her. EDLIKA was said to have been sedated by hospital staff because she seemed confused, and she screamed repeatedly, "I've killed them all." The girls, aged 13, 10, and 4, were declared dead on the scene by officers. Lieutenant Colonel Rocco Italiano, of the paramilitary Carabinieri Police, said the whole apartment was covered in blood. There was nothing that could be done for the victims. They were all dead with multiple stab wounds from a kitchen knife. An ambulance spokesman said the blood was flowing like a river all across the apartment. Dr. Idella Kathleen Hagen is a former medical doctor who killed her parents, Idella Hagen, aged 92, and James Hagen, aged 86, with a plastic bag and a pillow, as they slept in their home in Chatham Township, New Jersey, just before 7 a.m. on Saturday, August 26, 2000. Hagen phoned Township Police and told them her parents were dead. She had been with the bodies between 4 and 7 days, authorities believed. A New Jersey judge acquitted Dr. Hagen of charges after 2 psychiatrists testified that the doctor was psychotic at the time. She thought she was receiving messages from television ads, traffic lights, and playing cards. She also heard a male voice commanding her to commit the murders. She was committed to a state mental health institution on February 1, 2002. On June 6, 1991, Michael Bethke used a butcher's knife to decapitate his co-worker, Joseph Lesinski, at the White Hen Pantry in Burnham, Illinois. Bethke, who was 28 at the time, struck as his victim bent over to pick up a carton of cigarettes, and is said to have lopped off the head in one move. He wrote the word, "Repent," in blood on his victim's head and left it, as if on display, in the glass counter of the deli. After wandering in nearby woodland for a few hours, Bethke approached a group of people and told them to call police. He claimed he was suffering from command hallucinations that ordered him to kill. In 1993 he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and ordered to be held at the secure Elgin Mental Health Center. He was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. Bevan Spencer von EINEM is a convicted child murderer and suspected serial killer from Adelaide, South Australia. He was convicted in 1984 for the murder of a 15-year-old Adelaide teenager named Richard Kelvin. Kelvin was murdered by von EINEM on or around July 10, 1983. Bevan had abducted, held captive, sexually abused, drugged, and tortured the teenager for 5 weeks. Kelvin's whereabouts was unknown until his clothed body was found 7 weeks later on July 24, 1983 alongside a dirt airstrip near One Tree Hill in the Adelaide Hills area. The autopsy revealed that Richard Kelvin had most likely died from massive blood loss from an anal injury. He had suffered severe bruising and injuries from blows to his head, the left side of his back and right buttock, as well as a fractured front tooth. Dennis Nilsen was a Scottish serial killer and necrophile, known as the Muswell Hill Murderer and the Kindly Killer. He was known to commit acts of necrophilia, strangle, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. Nilsen murdered and dismembered young men in London between 1978 and 1983. His victims would be lured to these addresses through deception and killed by strangulation, sometimes accompanied by drowning. Nilsen observed a ritual in which he bathed and dressed the victims' bodies before dissecting and disposing of the remains. He kept various body parts around his home for an extended amount of time. Nilsen died at York Hospital in 2018 while still in custody. He had been transferred to the hospital after complaining of stomach pains. During surgery, a blood clot ended his life. Dean Corll was an American serial killer and rapist known as the Candy Man, because he and his family had previously owned and operated a candy factory in Houston Heights, and he had been known to give free candy to local children. Corll, along with 2 teenage accomplices named David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 28 young men between 1970 and 1973 in Houston, Texas. All of his victims were males, aged 13 to 20, the majority of whom were in their mid-teens. They were then stripped naked and tied to either Corll's bed, or a plywood torture board which was regularly hung on the wall. The crimes are known as the Houston mass murders. Dean Corll was murdered by his accomplice, Elmer Wayne Henley, after Corll had turned on him. Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. is a convicted American serial killer. Henley was convicted in 1974 for his role in the Houston mass murders, in which a minimum of 28 teenage boys and young men were abducted, tortured, raped and murdered by Dean Corll. Between 1970 and 1973, Henley and David Owen Brooks, Corll's other teenage accomplice, together and individually, lured many of the victims to Corll's home. Henley, then 17 years old, shot Corll dead on August 8, 1973. Henley is serving 6 consecutive terms of 99 years for his involvement in the killings, which at the time were characterized as the deadliest case of serial murders in American history. Henley was not charged with the death of Dean Corll, which was ruled self-defense. David Owen Brooks was an American convicted murderer and accomplice of serial killer Dean Corll, who, along with Elmer Wayne Henley, abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 28 boys and young men between 1970 and 1973 in Houston, Texas. He was offered $200 for any boy he could lure to Corll's apartment. An enticement he accepted. The crimes, which became known as the Houston mass murders, came to light after Henley fatally shot Corll. Many of the victims had been friends of Brooks and Henley. At the time of their discovery, the Houston mass murders were considered the worst example of serial murder in American history. In the years between his 1975 conviction and his death in 2020, Brooks was repeatedly denied parole. Finally in 2018,